I'm Dr. Pete Economo, the East Coast psychologist.
And I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin, the West Coast psychologist.
And this is When East
Meets West.
Pete, this is an episode we've teased for a long time that you and I have been we've been really interested in talking about. And today, we've got a little bit of a provocative title here for any, any psychodynamic clinicians out there listening, which is we're going to talk about the problem with Freud today.
It's about time.
It's about time. We're also going to talk a lot about, what we owe thanks. We owe a lot of gratitude to Freud and his contributions to the field. But we thought it was really important to talk about this because, I would say if, just average listeners out there that aren't clinicians, most people, when they're thinking about anything related to psychology or psychotherapy, really tend to think about stuff that's Freudian based. And our job, right? One of the reasons we wanted to do this podcast was to disseminate information about the most current methods in behavioral science, and then of course in Eastern spiritual traditions that we use quite a bit of, right? So I don't know, anything you want to add before we kind of dive into some of the a little bit of the history here and a little info?
Well, you and I are not experts in psychodynamic or psychoanalytic theory. We're going to break that down a little bit for our listeners, and because I think when our listeners see a therapist on television, they're often a Freudian type therapist that's portrayed in a lot of media.
Well, so, in treatment, the new season just came out, right?
That's still live.
They just have a new season.
I can't imagine.
Yes, a new season. So that's right. On TV, it's almost always a psychoanalyst.
Yeah. So go ahead. Sorry.
No, you please. No.
Well, so we're thankful for a lot of the theory because what we were going to say for at least for modern psychotherapy, if it weren't for some of the Freudian stuff, that maybe we wouldn't. I also just joke. I always joke and say Freud also gave us cocaine, which because there was Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
I'm not sure. I remember reading that I don't think he developed it, but I think he studied it as a treatment modality for some folks.
Interesting.
It would be very interesting because if you think about some of his theory, cocaine is an upper.
Yeah.
Perhaps that was how he got, that's why all his theories are so sexualized. I don't know.
Maybe I was going to say, cocaine, it's almost it mirrors a manic episode. So
that's right.
So there's that's that's fascinating. See, guys, I learned stuff in real time.
Well, I'll break that down a little bit because that's also I came from a program that trained more in psychodynamic theory than you did, right? Because I don't think you really got much of, if any.
No, I did get some.
Oh, you did? Okay.
I did get some, but the difference, and we have mentioned this a little bit on the podcast before that, Pete obviously trained in, the New York metropolitan area. So
on the
East Coast, which and New York itself is really a hub of psychoanalysis. And on the West Coast, it's just not the dominant theory and practice. And there are some reasons for that, which obviously we're going to talk about today. So, so maybe let's just start with, a little bit of history and also just explaining why we do owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Freud. So psychoanalysis, he really sort of coined it, or it was officially sort of came into the mental health world in 1896. He was in Vienna.
Yep.
And, Freud, he's the first person to really do psychotherapy in the way that we do it today, right? And again, listeners will be familiar with sort of the imagery of a patient lying on the couch, right?
Yeah.
Right. That is specifically psychoanalytic. So other types of therapy don't do that. So just if you're listening, you haven't been in therapy, when Pete and I see patients in person,
there's no laying down.
There's no laying down.
Sometimes I do laying down for Shavasana, but all right, I'm just
sure, but not for not for the treatment, right?
Not for the
it's
treatment.
No, we're sitting, the person's sitting on a couch, and we do have a couch, but we're speaking face to face.
Yeah.
So, he started this process of creating a space to begin to explore, I think the word he would probably use is the psyche, right? And honestly, Freud, had a lot of theories related to like exploring the unconscious. So like dreams and dream analysis. And there, there's a lot of overlap, I would say, humans have all, I don't know, with any kind of some spiritual traditions, honestly, just like exploring the depths of the mind, right? And so it was at the time very cutting edge.
It was very cutting edge, and that's really where the couch came in, because it was free association was the technique they used.
Yes,
and so
correct.
The providers
say what that is for.
So people. Free association was just this idea of like that was getting into consciousness. So whatever came up and whatever arose during the conversation is what he would say would get deeper down into the unconscious. Yes. And that's why the couch often faced away from the provider, because they didn't want to have anything that was like interfering. And I think there's even a research, or like psychoanalysts are trained. I think I'm forgetting now, but I think the couch either faces the window or vice versa. So even in terms of the office, there's like the angle in which the provider is versus the window is also really relevant.
I also don't remember what the direction is, but yes, you are right. There's like a certain orientation in terms of the office. That also, yes. And it also has to do with, the transference and the countertransference, right?
So break that down for us.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So another part of Freud's theory is that what's going to happen in the room between the relationship between the patient and the therapist is that the patient's brain, I guess we could say it that way, is going to, in the moment, kind of like, how do I want to say it, re-experience or reenact what they experience with other people and put that onto the therapist, which is called transference. So it might be like, let's say the patient has a difficult relationship with their father, and
I become their father.
You become their father, and the idea is for the therapist to be as blank a slate as possible, so that they're not influencing the transference in any way. That they want the reenactment, so to speak.
So say more about the being blank as possible.
Yeah, so it's
because you got fluorescent pink nails. There's nothing blank about that.
Truth. That's right. Yeah, different schools of thought here, right? So so it's being a blank slate, not reacting, being sort of again as blank as possible. Like, so that would include like in the way someone dresses as well. And then countertransference is the way that the clinician feels towards the patient. That's a term actually we still use across different types of psychological theory and modalities today. So like we use that as cognitive behavioral therapists as well.
Well, I love how you just said that. It's across therapeutic modalities, because it's not an us and them.
Thank you for saying that. That's right.
Yeah, because a lot of times, especially like East-West, right, even in the practice of psychoanalysis, that it's like us versus, it's cognitive behavioral therapy versus psychoanalysis, and it's not.
It's not, no, and that's where Pete and I, especially Pete's obviously still in the East Coast, and I definitely had this practice when I was living there. Our interest is in doing what is effective and what's evidence-based, and not disregarding anything that's come before, and of course keeping things that are still working, though also recognizing when there are some things that are not working or don't work as well. So this is like the practice of flexibility, and this us versus them. I'm so glad you're bringing that up. Not only, and it doesn't matter who, and it could be CBT versus psychoanalysis, or it could be anything, like humanistic existential versus, I don't know, family systems or something, right? Whatever. That shuts down curiosity, openness, right? And we how, to me, it always sort of is like boggles my mind. I find it extremely perplexing, because I'm like, our commitment as clinicians is to help people evolve and grow in ways that are most effective. And how are we going to do that if we're focused on judging what works and what doesn't? Like I have said, actually, Dr. Danielle Keenan-Miller, who we had on for our disordered eating episode, she actually mentioned this to me the other day. She said when she was interviewing me, she's like, I don't know if you remember this, Nikki, but when I was interviewing you for to work at UCLA, she said, I said to her, if a bunch of research came out tomorrow and said CBT doesn't work at all, I would stop doing it.
That's right.
And she said, I just was like, I love you. I want to hire you. And I said, I don't remember saying it to you, but I said, I say that all the time. And I mean it because we want to keep evolving. And so
keep evolving for what works.
Right. So if we go back to our title here of like the problem with Freud, is that there has been an attachment in our field to aspects of Freudian theory that don't work that well.
And we're going to talk about some evidence-based Freudian theories. I'm going to break it down. I want to break it down a little bit. I'm going to have you go to that one, but because we've been talking about psychoanalysis, and just for our listeners, what's important is psychoanalysis. Howard Stern is, famously will talk about psychoanalysis and has been a patient of psychoanalysis for a long time, and that requires a lot of money, and b like 3 days a week going in to see your therapist, and that's
3 to 5
days a week to go see your therapist. So that's not something that most people can afford. And however, those that offer psychoanalysis have gone through psychoanalysis themselves. So that's also a commonality with mindfulness, because as a mindfulness provider, you want to also have your own practice.
That's right.
The other psychodynamic is Freudian informed, and so that would be more of a, borrowing a lot of the theory, but a typical kind of 1 day a week, an hour a week, every week. The difference also there is that it's every week for an unidentified amount of time. So, and oftentimes it could be for like one's entire life. Whereas, in CBT, we tend to kind of be more solution focused. So I quickly just wanted to talk about the theory of like one other theory. So, Nikki, transference, really important. One other thing that, again, we're not experts, but id, ego, and superego you may have heard of. And that's a big piece of any kind of Freudian based therapy, thinking about, id as this like pleasure principle, like instinct, which is like someone's desire to either like have sex or to like kill, whereas the ego is like reality. So ego would come in and be like, well, you can't really kill that person because it's against the law. And superego is also morality there of like, well, it's also like not good to do that to people because that's a mean thing to do. So I just wanted to like make space for that. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can also say like those concepts also, I mean, those probably resonate with people because like they're, those are aspects of how humans orient. Like we don't use that language in in behavioral
like id,
therapy.
ego, superego.
Yeah, we don't, and yet those concepts we absolutely talk about, right? We talk about like what are the biological drives, like, right? That's of course, right? We talk about that all the time.
A dialectic.
Right, a dialectic. We talk about like seeing reality as it is, like with a, that's part of mindfulness. And we also talk about like the morality piece. Like we could kind of link that a little bit to values, frankly, right? Though I think if I'm remembering correctly, the superego gets actually kind of judgy. Actually, I think the superego can get a little bit rules oriented, which again, humans do that.
The brain likes that.
The brain likes that.
So what would you say about the sexuality part of it?
That to me personally is what I find the most problematic. I don't know if you agree with that. So
I do.
So, Freud's theory relied pretty heavily on kind of viewing humans as, I mean, look, we are sexual being, or, again, this is where some people are asexual. In many humans are sexual, but I think, well, that's important so there's an assumption that everybody is sexual, number one. And two, he really characterized different stages of development, and I would say many behaviors as somehow linking back to sex. And this is where I also want to mention just and maybe we'll do another episode on this, but there is some I can't get too deep into it today, but there are power dynamics related to men and women that existed at that time that, Freud, obviously, he was a doctor, he saw a lot of female patients. And then I just want listeners to think about, and then, what that must be like, that then there's an assumption that everything has to do with sex. And he would also talk about, there's also things about talking about like in childhood that sex is a big,
name those.
There's like, this is where I'm going to forget some of them, but it's like the anal stage, right?
Oh,
for example, like that. This is, my apologies, listeners, as Pete's saying, we're not experts.
No, I'm sorry. I was thinking more of like the Oedipus complex.
Well, those two. So will you actually share a little bit about that? Like,
so like there's the Oedipus complex, or like the, I don't think it's based on that. It was like the Electra complex. So essentially like sort of like a child wanted to have sex with their parent or idolize their parent, so
Right.
again, we're not experts in this. We're probably saying this wrong. Certainly someone who has like gone through analysis or is a provider would discuss this differently. But the underlying theory there is that there's like organ envy or like primary sex organ envy,
well, actually say what it is. Specifically, he said penis envy, that women, envy like having that men have penises.
That's right.
So and the Oedipus complex really was specifically saying that young boys do want to have sex, that boys want to have sex with their mother and get rid of the father by killing him. That he believed that was like a natural biological, like inborn urge.
Right. Which sounds kind of nuts and psychotic.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah. So, I mean, and so I think we can use this as a segue to say, like, look, theories, any kind of theory is just that. Like people we make hypotheses based on the information available. And so, like we said, like a lot of Freud's theories at the time were very cutting edge. They were provocative, right? This isn't like in the Victorian era, right? To be talking about sex at all, right? Even this, he started to say like there's an unconscious and like what's going on behind the scenes in our brain that we're not paying attention to.
Yep.
So theories are hypotheses.
I think sometimes they take these as facts, right? Like I think right.
Yes. Well, that's where we're sort of coming up on where I think, that there's the problems here is that, we want to be able to, as clinical scientists, to be willing to acknowledge like, what do we know and what don't we know?
Yeah.
And look, there hasn't been any data to suggest that young boys want to have sex with their mothers and kill their fathers. haven't been able to conclude that yet, right? Mm-hmm. Though, look, we do have plenty of data that people have biological drives, for example, right? And so I think that where Freudian approaches can get really sticky is that, yes, that there's often, and this has been my experience when I was consulting with folks that have, and I've had some really, I should say, I had some wonderful psychoanalyst colleagues in New York. We had some really great.
We still do, right?
Some great conversations and talk a lot about sort of like the conceptual overlap.
Well, actually, go ahead, I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say, maybe you could talk about like the evidence-based psychodynamic therapy, because that's what I also hear saying is like the data that is there is like AEDP.
Right. Well, so let me say this part first, and then we can talk about that. So, because those therapies are focusing on what do we know, right? Exactly. So people that are focusing on what we like being attached to some of the older stuff, like what Pete was just saying, is that what I've often noticed is that because psychoanalytic approaches often rely on an intervention called interpretation, interpreting what the patient is saying. And I say to people, and especially when I'm training students, I'm like, therapists, we certainly make interpretations, which are just guesses about what we think is going on. However, I would say my experiences from a Freudian approach, interpretations are talked about as truths, as facts, which we've talked about. We have an episode on judgments, and interpretations are just opinions. They're just judgments so when I'm talking to somebody, I say it's a guess. I'm going like, I don't know, this is what I think. But then I ask the patient, what do you think? Does that resonate with you? As opposed to, this is what's happening, right? This like is your dream means this. Right. It's like, and I say to patients all the time, people will talk to me about dreams, and I'll go, they're like, what does this mean? I'm like, oh, I don't think it takes being a psychologist to know what a dream is. I was like, sounds like you're scared. I don't know. What do you think it means? Right. Right. Yeah. So I think it's this concept of like being willing to let go of saying we know everything. And so, yes, there are a number of evidence-based psychodynamic, excellent treatments, emotion focused therapy, accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy. I think there's one also called brief short-term psychodynamic therapy. There's transfer focused psychotherapy, which is for borderline personality disorder. There's a lot of excellent ones out there. Though, again, as why I love behavioral science, it's like, I'm just really interested in like, what's the data say? You know what I'm saying? I mean, would you add anything to that?
No, so on one hand, what I hear is like, it's nice, beautiful dialectic. On one hand, we're saying like, there's a lot of similarity. We're certainly, any kind of behaviorism is born out of this, especially in the Western world. But that there's, if tomorrow I learned that CBT wasn't good for panic, I wouldn't start doing CBT with panic.
Right. And you know what I want to add in too is that, so behavioral science, right, is the study of human behavior. And so there's actually one of my favorite behavioral science books is called Learning RFT, Relational Frame Theory, which we've mentioned on here before. And in that book, there's a great example where it's saying like, you can apply behavioral science to literally anything, even to psychoanalysis, because you're two humans in a room doing behavior. And so what I would say is like, I want to have, the more knowledge we have, the more we can help people. So again, to me, I'm like, I talk about countertransference, right? I talk about countertransference, and I would like to keep adding knowledge and using behavioral science to continue to help people change and improve their lives. And so, obviously, Freud's not my guy. He's not, and I'm grateful for his contributions to the field.
And before you wrap it up, there's not much to add from the East for this, because this is really just that kind of Western, theory. But what I will say is like, I do think, Eastern practices are a bit more like accessible. So they're like really more global, that really any culture, any person can. Whereas, something like a Freudian type based therapy is really maybe more Western based and certainly more privilege based. And that's a lot of the criticism where it's, really white man based too.
That's right. Well, and I mean, it's straight up from Europe. I mean, you know what I'm saying? So that's such an important point. But I think also like some of the Eastern approach we're taking is to just practice this mindful, non-judgmental approach and this openness to like, let's take in data, let's take in things that are effective, and also being willing to let go or evolve past things that maybe no longer fit this moment. So, listeners, hopefully you've learned a little something about what's helpful about Freud and what's not so helpful. And maybe what you can take with you is a model to say that, if we're willing to grow, we're willing to evolve. It also means sometimes letting go of something that was helpful at one time.
This has been When East Meets West. I'm Dr. Nikki Rubin.
And I'm Dr. Pete Economo. Be present, be brave. This has been When East Meets West. All material is based on opinion and educational training of Drs. Pete Economo and Nikki Rubin.
Content is for informational and educational purposes only.